So when I first started building my business back in 2009, at that time, all I thought about was making a lot of money. I wanted to bring in a lot of sales, make a lot of profit. Didn't so much think about the keeping it side. And so early on in my business, ramped up sales very quickly. Wasn't a lot of profit in the business. So I figured out how to actually produce profit in the business. Then I kind of had to do the same journey in my personal life with personal finances, because once again, I was just focused on, bringing cash in, buying nice things and that sort of thing. And so, but I found out over time that, buying a lot of this nice stuff didn't really make me any happier. And so along the way, I started reading a ton of personal finance material, reading a bunch about what other people that I consider very smart and rational when it comes to money and finances, such as Warren Buffett, what they had to say about the topic, and started trying a lot of this stuff out in my own life. And so I've come down to rules that I think work for me, for personal finance, for building a lifetime of wealth that I think will work for you too. Feel free to think about them, try them out. I'm not saying they're the only way to run your personal financial life, but they work for me, and I think they'll work for a lot of people, and they should at least be considered. And maybe even try them out for a period of time and see if they make your life better, if they result in more money and less stress for you. So rule number 1, save 25% or more of your pre-tax income. Now, the number is somewhat arbitrary. Some people may say more. Some people may say, 10% is fine. It may depend on your income, your lifestyle, a lot of factors. But the part that I think you can't get away from is that if you want to never have to worry about money, you've got to find a way to spend less than you make. I think 25% is a good target to start with. Save at least 25%. It doesn't even matter what you do with it with this first rule, as long as you're not spending it. The way most people live their lives is they're constantly spending slightly more than what they're making, which is why they end up accumulating debt, which is why they end up buying a house that's bigger than what they should, a car that's more expensive than what they should, and why I think the average person, I've heard some statistics, couldn't come up with $400 in the case of an emergency. And so the first rule is you've got to spend less than you make, and I think saving at least 25% of your pre-tax income is a good target. Rule number 2 is avoid debt. A lot of times, there's some tax incentives, and a lot of people want to go out there and buy a house. They think that's important for their life. They want to take a, loan out to buy a car. Some people take loans out to buy pools and all kinds of other stuff, finance jewelry, and a ton of other purchases. I think if you can, I'd almost avoid every single type of debt out there. That includes credit card debt. I went for probably 10 years, without using a personal credit card. I literally used a debit card. Because I didn't like I knew I personally, and MIT has confirmed this with a study that they've done, is that you tend to spend more if you're using a credit card versus using cash. And I think in their study, they meant literally like paper cash. But I imagine it still applies, at least to some extent, with the debit card, because you only have so much money in your bank account, and when that's gone, you don't have any money left to spend. And people tend to overspend and spend more when they're using a credit card, because there's kind of a delayed pain there. You don't have to pay it off for a little while. And so I would avoid almost every kind of debt. For a lot of people, to me, I would even not buy a house, meaning you have to get a mortgage, but that may be the one exception for a certain kind of person. It's somewhat a forced savings. There are some tax benefits. You may get appreciation in the value of the home, though that's not really guaranteed, and I wouldn't depend on that. It's an assumption a lot of people make. But outside of that, I would avoid basically every other kind of debt. No credit card. I wouldn't use debt to pay for a car. If you want to use a loan to buy a car for, say, $25,000, I think you'd be better off saving $5,000 in cash and then buying the cheapest car you can possibly afford, if that's all you can afford, and to use cash for almost everything else. And cash meaning money that's actually in your bank account, using a debit card, wire transfer, whatever, not literally paper cash. But rule number 2 for me is avoid debt. Rule number 3 is don't buy something you can't handle a 50% decline in value. Now, that may not be a permanent loss, but say, for example, like right now, I'm in Austin, Texas, and pretty much everywhere in the entire world right now, but especially in Austin, Texas, home prices have gone through the roof. People are stretching their last dollar to buy a house, and I feel like most people don't realize that there's a possibility. You never know when it can happen, but if you're buying at the very, very, very top of the market, which nobody knows when that is, I'm not saying it's now, it could be, it may not be for years, but if you're buying at the very, very top of the market, even though the market overall may keep doing well long term, there's a chance that if you buy at the very top, that you could still take a big cut in value on the properties. Eventually, maybe there's a lot of new houses that get built, some of that sort of supply is released, and then your house could decline in value, maybe not as much by 50%, but maybe 20%, maybe 30%. Maybe you're underwater on your mortgage a little bit. And so if you're willing to sort of ride that out long term, if you're like, okay, cool, like if that happens, I'll be in here for another 5, 10 years, 15 years if I have to, totally fine. But I think a lot of people think that it's only going to keep going one direction. People do this with stock market investments, investing in tech companies, a lot of things like that, buying houses that are very expensive. And I think they don't realize that there's a chance that no matter what you buy, it could decline in value by a significant amount. And there's a good chance that just from natural cycles that it will happen at some point. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying anything that you can't handle personally, emotionally, financially, a decline in value of up to 50%. It's something you should mentally prepare yourself for. Otherwise, I don't think you should be buying it. Rule number 4, keep 6 months of living expenses in cash. This is to make sure you don't go out there and have to make a bad last-minute decision. Next couple rules cover more investing, but rule number 4 is that, say for example, you make a good investment, but then all of a sudden you have a medical emergency or your car breaks down, you have to buy a new car or something, and you need to get access to some of that money. You may end up having to sell some of that investment at a terrible price, or interest rates may have gone up like crazy and you have to refinance a mortgage at a really bad rate to get extra cash out of your house, for example. And so I recommend keeping at least 6 months of living expenses in cash. This is pretty typical advice, but I think the reason is so you have the cushion to not have to make bad financial decisions in other areas of your life. Rule number 5 is to start investing immediately, likely mostly in an S&P 500 index fund. Warren Buffett's recommended portfolio, 90% in an S&P 500 index fund, 10% in short-term government bonds. Now, that assumes you're going to invest over a long time horizon, but it's hard to say. Some people will say, very smart investors will say that, okay, you can kind of tell when a market is overpriced, and probably there is truth to that, but I think for most people that's probably over their heads. They're not going to sit there and want to research price earning ratios of the market and look at the earnings of the top 500 companies in the US and start digging through annual reports and economic information. Like, most people are not going to want to do all that stuff. And so in general, you're probably better off if you're saving at least 25% of your income, start putting a good chunk of that into an S&P 500 index fund. Over long term, it seems to work out fine. Pre-tax return, I think around 10% is kind of expected for S&P 500 index fund. Pretty much anyone who's trying to tell you to do something else, oh, you should go buy this real estate thing, or you should do this other kind of complex investment, is typically trying to make money off of you doing that. I have zero financial incentive to tell you to put money in an S&P 500 index fund. Warren Buffett, maybe somewhat, because his company, Berkshire Hathaway, is included in that. But I think in general, it's a pretty safe bet as long as you're willing to ride it out long term. Some people, they freak out and they take their money out, and that's when it ends up causing bad problems with rule number 5, which is why I come to rule number 6, is to stay invested even when the market inevitably declines. They say there's a correction, which typically means a drop of 20% or more, at least once a year. That's just kind of normal in the stock market. And so if an S&P 500 index fund is the greatest balance of potential reward and the least amount of risk possible over the long term, that only works if you're not freaking out when the market declines like it inevitably does from time to time, and pulling all your money out, doing the exact opposite of what you want to do, which is basically buying high and selling low, which is what a lot of people end up doing. And so they end up taking these massive permanent losses on their investments. And so if you're going to put money into an index fund or any kind of investment that has a long-term positive payoff expectancy, then you want to make sure you don't pull it out whenever the market inevitably declines, because it will. A lot of people haven't studied this stuff, haven't been through these kind of cycles. I mean, I graduated college right in the middle of the financial crisis, and I was studying finance, so all this stuff was very top of mind. And a lot of people just, it's new. They haven't ever experienced massive declines when they have real money on the line, and that's when it kind of lets you know if you actually believe in your investment strategy or philosophy, is when stuff like that happens. 15 out of the past 20 years, so the past 2 decades, the S&P 500 has increased in value, which kind of gives you an idea. Only 5 of those 20 years did it decrease in value from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, which tells you that there are downturns, but the general long-term trend is up. And so if you can keep your money invested without freaking out and pulling it out when things happen, then you should have a lot better chance of building long-term wealth. So these to me are 6 relatively obvious rules, but the hard part is actually doing them, actually sticking with them. But I believe that if you do, that you'll build a lot of wealth over the long term. Now, we're very big into building businesses and increasing your income. That will amplify all of this. If you put all of these in place and you devote some chunk of money, say you're still saving 25% or more of your income, but you take some extra part of your money, you go out there and build a business, and all of a sudden you find a way to make an extra $1 million, $2 million, or 50 grand a month, or 100 grand a month, or whatever the number is, that can all trickle down through this. And so that no matter how much you make, no matter how small or how big, you're still building a lifetime of wealth. So hopefully you found this useful. I follow these rules myself as best as I possibly can, and I think they'll help you too.